So we are here today to talk about first 4 ways to use a private podcast. So why should you even consider it? Why should you consider using a private podcast? Well, I did an entire podcast episode about this, and I really want to iterate the 4 ways that you could use it. So like I said, there's a whole podcast episode that I will send you the link or give you the link to in a second, but it really goes into all the details of why having a private podcast is so important or ways to use it. But we're just going to cover the highlights here. So we're going to talk about using a private podcast in a traditional webinar style. We're going to talk about offering exclusive rates for your offers. We're going to dive a little bit into the behind the scenes and how you can share success stories and testimonials. But I have to tell you, private podcasts are here to stay. I'm going to be covering so many things about them, and now that I've kind of dove headfirst into how I could use a private podcast, I have so many ideas, all the ideas and so many future things that I cannot wait to experiment with. So let's first dive into the first way. So this is tip number 1 or way number 1 that you can use a private podcast. Number 1, you can lead people, or you can use it traditional webinar style by leading people to your webinar registration. Now, in this particular podcast episode where I talked about this, I gave a very specific example of how the private podcast that I signed up for as a consumer, as a listener, I signed up for this podcast and I ended up buying the thing. I ended up purchasing what this podcaster was selling because it led me from you have to opt in to receive the podcast feed. And then she ended up having where you could like get on a sales call with her team, or you could send someone to a webinar registration, a masterclass training. So you could use this in a sense of the typical style of selling on a webinar, or you could just replace it altogether. You could say, you know what? Instead of doing the traditional webinar, I'm going to replace it with the audio content. So in essence, you are creating the same type of content. It's just a different way to deliver it. Same content, different delivery. And I love this idea because so many of us are really busy. I'm a busy mom. I have 3 kids, busy working mom, running my own business. And I think that while I love masterclasses, having the accessibility to listen to something on the go. I'm folding my laundry, I'm doing the dishes, I'm cleaning, I'm making dinner. This is what I do day in and day out in my life. And if someone says, well, you have to sit down and watch this thing for 60 minutes, or you could go on your daily workout, your walk, and listen to it. Maybe you would want to do both. I don't know. This is where, your imagination could run wild with the possibilities of how you could use this. But I do like the idea of supplementing a traditional webinar style with a private podcast. I think it could work so beautifully. So let's go full screen again here. So the second thing we're going to talk about is having exclusive rates and promotions. Now, I love the idea of being able to offer listeners deals that aren't available anywhere else. They're not posted on the sales page. They're not on your social media. They're not in your regular podcast content. This gives you an opportunity to say, you know what? I think I'm going to try out like a discount code, or maybe offering an exclusive bonus for people that go to a specific URL. There are so many different ways that you can do this. And in the podcast episode where I talked about this, the person that was delivering the private podcast, she actually said, if you sign up for the program that she was offering, she had like a low ticket product, and then she had a higher end product. And she said, if you're interested in our higher end, you could get $100 off the service that she was doing by mentioning you listen to this podcast. And I thought, Wow, that's genius. Like, why didn't we do this before? Because I know a lot of people are hesitant to put things on sale or to have something that's like, I don't know that I want to discount it for everyone. But if you had coupon codes that were in your private podcast, you could still offer that up to your audience without having it accessible to everyone. So this is another way that I really like to use a private podcast. So number 3, behind the scenes, top secrets. Like that's what it says here. It's top secret things. I love the idea of sharing exclusive content. Now, the way that I have it listed here is it says never before heard, seen, or shared content. So this is not posted anywhere else online, and a few things to consider, and what I'm actually considering for a future private podcast for myself is sharing income reports. This is something that has been done traditionally for a long time in the blogging space, where people will share their monthly income reports, or they'll talk about what they've made in their business. And while I love this, I think that as podcasters, as business owners, this could be a really cool way to share that information and then take it down. You don't have to keep up a private podcast and we're going to talk about the different things to consider before you actually publish your podcast, but you don't have to leave it up forever. You could just put it up while you're launching something, and then you could take it down. And that information doesn't have to live out there online for someone to just come across it. You could also share statistics or downloads that are behind the scenes that you don't typically share with your audience. You could keep that in a private podcast format, or other numbers that your audience would find intriguing. Now, I know a lot of my audience are a lot of online business owners and entrepreneurs, and maybe you have some information that you would want to keep kind of close to the chest or behind closed doors. But if you were just putting it out there for a short period of time, and maybe you were talking about a time in your business that isn't right now, maybe it was when you were getting started, or maybe it's just some other important information that you're like, I don't really know that I want to share that on my regular podcast because anybody could hear it. Putting it in a private podcast could absolutely be an option, because then you're going to take it down when you're done launching. Okay, the 4th way to use a private podcast is to share student stories and testimonials. So this is an opportunity for you to really highlight student success stories. And you can do this by using interviews or audio clips or coaching calls that you've done in the past. Something that's really cool, and I put the link up here, but more about how to create a private podcast and why you would want to is I put it down here at the bottom. So go check out episode 304 of the Proffitt Podcast. It's all about why you should create a private podcast for your next launch, which is a lot of the things that we just talked about, but I go deeper into the exact example of the private podcast I listened to that encouraged me to purchase this program. And what ended up happening is I was also inspired by a friend that I have in the industry, in the online business space, who started using a private podcast for her coaching calls. So she would do Zoom calls, and then whenever she was finished, she would take the audio from those Zoom calls and it was behind a paywall. So you had to be a member of her community, of her program, and it was supplementing what she already had as a paid product. So it wasn't something new. I mean, I guess she could have kept that as like a one-off purchase, like, oh, you're not part of the program, but you can purchase this thing. That probably wouldn't have aligned with what she was doing. But what she did is she took her coaching calls that she did a lot of group coaching, and she put it as a private podcast for those people that weren't able to make it live, instead of going back. Because, I mean, let's be honest, most of us don't want to sit down and watch a Zoom of people talking. But if it's in an audio form, I mean, I could pop in my earbuds and go on a walk and listen to the whole thing that way.